So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are. I can see right now we've got just over 100 people. Maybe a few more will join in shortly. So today is the first session of this academic year's EUC Seminar Series. It's going to be fully online and it's all going to be around degrowth. So we're going to touch on several topics, but for this first session, it's all going to be about degrowth in general. What is it? What it isn't? Controversies around its name. What are its objectives? How it has developed from an academic point of view, but also from a social movement point of view. And we have today with us two great speakers. We have Peter Victor, who is an emeritus professor from York University's Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. Peter has a very prolific career. He has worked on environmental issues for over 40 years. A couple of his most recent books are Managing Without Growth, Slower by Design and Not Disaster, and The Costs of Economic Growth. So yes, we're very lucky to have Peter here with us, a highly influential academic in this area. And we also have Sam Bliss from the University of Vermont. Sam has recently finished his PhD, and he spends most of his time studying and participating in the production and distribution of food that is not for sale. So Sam's research is all around food access and also teaching ecological economics. And he is a member of Degrow US and Research and Degrowth. And to help us run everything smoothly today, we have my colleague Anna Zalik from EUC's, also from York University, the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. And Anna's research is around the area of global environmental politics and critical development studies. So yeah, we're very lucky to have such a great group of people here with us. Just a couple of logistics issues before we get started. You can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can ask questions there. One good feature about this is that if you really like someone else's question, you can click on the thumbs up, and therefore you can upvote questions that you really like. We'll be monitoring that throughout the session to select questions to read out after our speakers have presented. And you can also use the chat if you want to have some conversations. There's a big group of us here moderating the chat, so please use the chat nicely and respectfully. And I think that's everything. Again, thank you very much for joining us, and I will hand over to Anna to run the show now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lena, and thank you for organizing, you and your colleagues here in the faculty, this excellent series, and I'm happy to support. So I'm just going to read the York Land Acknowledgement, and then a couple of poems that I think are important at this moment. There's quite a bit of repression of Indigenous solidarity movements globally. So the York Acknowledgement recognizes that many Indigenous nations have longstanding relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The university acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Degrow has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities, and we acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Jishwish One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And so I want to read a poem by Lee Maracle, the late Stolo writer. It's called War. In my body flows the blood of Gaelic, Bastille stormers, and the soft, gentle ways of Salish Cree womanhood. Deep-throated bass tones dissipate, swallowed by the earth. Uproarious laughter sears, mutilates my voice. Child of the earth, tear of west, coast rain, dewdrops sparkling in the crisp, clear sun of my home. Warm woman of the Mediterranean sunscape, bleaching rough cotton sweatshop anniversary. Thunderous, rude earthquakes that split my spirit within. Tiny grapes of wine console me. Can I deny a heritage blackened by the toil of billions, conceived in rape, plunder, and butchery? In the veins that fight to root themselves in the wondrous breadth of my homeland races the blood of base humanity. European thief, liar, bloodsucker, I deny you not. I fear you not. Your reality and mine no longer rankles me. I am moved by my love for human life, by the firm conviction that all the world must stop the butchery, stop the slaughter. I am moved by my scars, by my own filth, to rewrite history with my body, to shed the blood of those who betray themselves. To life, world, humanity, I ascribe to my people, my history, I address my vision. And then a poem by the Palestinian poet who was arrested by Israeli authorities the day before yesterday and has apparently been released in Gaza. The poem is What is Home? Mossab Abu Toha. What is home? It is the shade of trees on my way to school before they were uprooted. It is my grandparents' black and white wedding photo before the walls crumbled. It is my uncle's prayer rug where dozens of ants slept on wintry nights before it was looted and put in a museum. It is the oven my mother used to bake bread and roast chicken before a bomb reduced our house to ashes. It is the cafe where I watched football matches and played. My child stops me. Can a four-letter word hold all of these? So with that, I'll turn over, I think, Sam, are you speaking first? Was that the plan? And then Peter, or Peter, are you speaking first and then Sam?
I'm ready to go if you've...
Okay, so please go ahead, Peter. So what we had just discussed is that if you'd like, I'll let you know at about the 1 minute mark, unless you have a timer in front of you, in which case I won't do that.
I have a timer, but a reminder won't hurt.
Okay, thanks so much. Please go ahead. Thank you.
So it's very nice to see you again, Anna. We'll chat later.
Yes, thanks so much.
With only a few minutes to speak to everybody, I'm going to go rather fast. And I just want to say how pleased I am to be participating in this webinar with Sam and with Anna. So degrowth has many definitions. The definition, the most succinct definition that I favor is this one by Jason Hickel. Degrowth is a planned reduction of energy and resource throughput designed to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a way that reduces inequality and improves human well-being. I think he captures a lot in those few lines, and we may have other people's ideas about what degrowth is, but that's the definition from which I'm starting. Degrowth is also, I'm going to add to Jason's definition, a critique of capitalism and its dependency on growth based on the drive for the accumulation of capital. And secondly, it's also a social movement centered primarily in continental Europe, but with an increasing presence in other parts of the world. And I think that's what's very interesting about degrowth. It's not just a set of intellectually interesting ideas, but it's also a social movement that's beginning to take root. Why do we need degrowth? I think the man who did the most to explain this and make the argument for it is Herman Daly. And his answer is that it's because we've moved from an empty world to a full world. And by that, he means there was a time gone by when the economy was small in relation to the globe. And the only thing that entered the globe was essentially solar energy, and all that left is waste heat. And inside you have the economy extracting matter and energy from the biosphere and releasing it back in degraded form. Some matter is recycled, and in an empty world, to use his phrase, much of human welfare, human well-being came directly from the ecosystem and only a limited amount from the economy. But now we've moved to a full world, where the scale of the global economy has expanded dramatically, along with it the material and energy flows, the throughput that that Jason was referring to in his definition has increased dramatically. And now much of human welfare comes from what the economy produces, but at the cost of what the ecosystem provides directly. Now let's look at some data to add some flesh to these bones. From 1900 to 2015, I'm going to show you what's happened to the global use of biomass, of fossil fuels, ores and industrial minerals, and construction minerals, the main categories of materials that we extract from the biosphere. Starting in 1900, this global annual amount increased steadily at about 1.5% per year. By 1950, the globe was using twice as much on an annual basis that it used in 1900. And then in the next 50 years, you can see the rapid increase in global extraction of materials, and it got even faster in the early years of this century. So no wonder, given that these materials get used but don't disappear, we're getting more and more impacts on the environment to try to accommodate these wastes. And one way of measuring that is using the global ecological footprint. The footprint measures the requirements placed on planet Earth by humans, and you can see down the right-hand side the major activities which place these demands on the biosphere. Carbon uptake, which is now a big problem because we're exceeding the capacity of the atmosphere and oceans to absorb our excess carbon, forest products, grazing land, and so on, that you can read for yourself. Well, as of 1970, the global ecological footprint just about equaled the best estimates of what the globe is able to provide on an ongoing basis. And that's why you see a 1 on the left-hand axis. The global footprint divided by biocapacity equaled 1. But after that, we've gone into great excess use of the capacity of the planet to support humans in the way we are living on it now, and much of that is carbon, but you can see all of the other components of the footprint have also increased significantly. Another way of telling much the same story is to look at planetary boundaries. I'm hoping everybody or most people on this webinar will be familiar with this, because I know I'm going very fast. But in 2019, a group of scientists identified 9 issues of global environmental significance, and said, well, you know, there's some capacity for the biosphere to absorb these pressures, but we've exceeded that in respect to biodiversity loss, climate change, and nitrogen being disposed of into the environment. In 2015, land system change was now at such a level that they concluded that that was another boundary that had been limited, and also phosphorus. And now 2023, you can see that 6 boundaries have been crossed. So this is evidence that humans have overshot the capacity of the biosphere to support us. Of course, the causes and consequences of this are extremely unequal among and within countries. And I read just this week an estimate that says the richest 1% globally account for more carbon emissions than the poorest 66%. So it shows you the huge disparity about impacts and causes of global overshoot attributable to humans. Well, how do we get out of this? Well, degrowth offers us a route. I'd like to just add a little bit to that. I like this ethical principle of contraction. And I can't see on my own screen here, excuse me. Well, you have to read it for yourself, that I can't read it. But anyway, the idea being that countries that are using less than some definition of a fair share can increase over time, and other countries which are above that come down until we're all more or less on the same level and continue to decline. Contraction and convergence, that's the term. Well, how do we move forward based upon these very rapidly explained observations? In my own work, I like to simulate national economies, in particular Canada, to look at alternative futures. And so I'm going to present very briefly the results of 2 scenarios. One is the base case, which is based upon a continuation of current policies, trends, and relationships, and what the economy would look like, roughly speaking, over the next 50 years, if we just try to carry on as we've been going in the past, and an escape scenario, which consists of many, many changes. an increased price on carbon emissions from electricity generation, rapid electrification of road and rail transport, a net zero carbon emissions being achieved. It'll take more than just a carbon price to do that. A switch from brown to green investment. Brown investment is conventional investment, largely driven by a search for profit or in support of that. And green investment is investment, the primary objective of which is to achieve some environmental objective. Increased transfer payments. This is payments by government from some people to others to reduce income inequality and reduce poverty. Reduced work hours. Many circular economy initiatives, recycling, reduction, reuse, of course, sharing, more durability, and things of that sort. And a population scenario, I picked the lowest one that Statistics Canada has on offer, which shows the population stabilizing by mid-century. You put all those things together, and now we can compare the results. I'm just going to give you 4. These scenarios run from this year to 2073, that's 50 years. First of all, material flows. In the base case, you're just going to go on increasing. Canada's share of, not share necessarily, but the quantity of materials we bring into our economy will just keep rising. Under the escape scenario, we see a sharp decline in material flows. It's the same story with the ecological footprint. Under the base case, that will still rise. Under the escape case, it can decline significantly. Greenhouse gases, well, under the base case, if we were to carry on with current policies, by the way, this is before the most recent change by the federal government, we wouldn't reach net zero by 2073, but we can under the escape case. And finally, if you want to know what's happening to GDP, it's such a popularly used measure. I'm not going to advocate its use, but I'm going to report it here. You see that under the base case, you get steady economic growth. Under the escape case, we'd be looking at stabilization. So you see there's some major choices that we can make, and they differ tremendously in terms of their impact on the biosphere. And we can also comment later on their implications for human well-being. In terms of policies and movements, as I said, degrowth is both a set of policy proposals and it's also a social movement. This is a list drawn up by Giorgio Callas of policies that he has advocated. A citizen debt audit, work sharing, basic and maximum income, that's interesting, green tax reform, stopping subsidies and public investment for polluting activities, and so on. I won't read them all, but they should pretty much be familiar with you or familiar to you. But I also want to mention a number of movements. Degrowth is listed here, but there's a lot of activity going on under different headings with some overlap. Some strengths, some weaknesses, but when we have this whole package of ideas, I think we are better for it. That starts with Herman Daly's steady state economy, based upon recognizing the biophysical limits facing humanity, the circular economy initiatives, regenerative economy, which is very much based on finance, well-being economy, a very interesting development there is that several governments have signed up to that. Buen vivir, which is a version of well-being, but the important thing is it's from the global south, and there's a lot to be learned from the global south. Kate Raworth's donut economy, which builds on the planetary boundaries and combines the sustainable development goals with those. Degrowth, which rejects growth and is desperately trying to build a movement. And eco-socialism, which goes the furthest in terms of calling for institutional economic change. Finally, I'm going to leave you with a picture of degrowth as I see it in the long term. Now, this on the upright axis shows the physical size of the economy with time on the horizontal axis. This is the era that we've been living in, with growth rapidly increasing, exceeding planetary boundaries, and now we're into this era of overshoot. Since we're exceeding the planetary boundaries, it can also reduce their size, and so we get in this part of this image degrowth taking root, which we hope, at least I hope it will, and bringing us down beneath the planetary boundaries until finally we're in a post-growth era, which is characterized by fluctuations, of course, in how and the physical size of the planet, or of the global economy rather, but staying below planetary boundaries. So to me, degrowth is not the end point, it's not the end goal, it's a movement in the right and an important direction. And with that, thank you for your attention and hope that I haven't taken up too much time.
Thanks so much, Peter. That was excellent and very informative presentation on the questions at hand. So I know we'll have an excellent discussion. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sam. Thanks so much, Sam.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be here and excited by how many people showed up virtually. Can you see my screen? Yes. Okay. Can I make it full screen? Yes. Awesome. Cool. Okay. Well, I'm going to focus on the what and the why of degrowth and try not to repeat Peter too much, but we have basically identical slides, and it's not a it's not a mistake or a coincidence. I took an ecological economics class 5 years ago that Peter taught, actually, and so his work's been a big influence on me. So to be on the same panel together is pretty exciting for me, and hopefully I can add things and not repeat too much. So I can focus on the what and the why, and it sounds like questions like how and more complicated questions are going to be addressed by future editions of this seminar series, or even the questions afterward. So this is a bunch of books that have been published in the last 10 years on this idea of degrowth. You know, I got interested in degrowth 10 years ago and started studying ecological economics because of that interest. And nobody really knew what the term was except for some nerds in ecological economics. And that's all changed. You know, I bet you everybody on this webinar has at least heard of it, or else you wouldn't have ended up here. And so there's a lot of curiosity about what it means and a lot of debate about what it means and is it the right word and all these questions. But it's worth going back to say, okay, why did this emerge in the first place, and what is it negating? What is this growth that it's critiquing? So growth refers to growth in GDP, and GDP measures the total monetary value of all the goods and services that are produced in an economy in a year. So everything that's purchased, that's goods and services that aren't secondhand goods or resold things that are new production in Canada in 1 year is the GDP, and growth is just when that number goes up. But if what we care about is reducing the overall physical size of the economy, why do we care about money? Well, since I'm an ecological economist, I have this really oversimplistic view that you saw a more complicated version of the same picture earlier. Think of the economy as a machine for turning nature into stuff and inevitably waste because of the laws of physics. And so growth is basically that, the economy turning more nature into more stuff. And while that seems like an abstraction or overly simplistic, like with the frontiers of extraction are expanding just like the square did on the Earth. And that creates environmental justice conflicts at those frontiers of extraction where people are living and where people are relying on those resources that come to be extracted and polluted by industry as the economy grows in this physical sense. So at this point in the rich economies in the world, we're using more resources than Earth can sustainably provide and generating waste faster than they can be assimilated. And this overly simplistic or seemingly simplistic view really holds up empirically. So the red line is the aggregation of all the different types of material use that Peter showed on his slide about materials, and the green line is the global GDP, and these variables correlate one-to-one more closely than any variables outside of a laboratory in science. And it turns out that since 1970, it's taken about $1 or it's taken about 1 kilogram of materials mined or harvested from the earth to create $1 worth of value. And that can change because of inflation, because, you know, prices go up and $1 buys less resources, but it hasn't changed because of any difference in the technical efficiency of the global economy. And so it stands to reason that we might need to, if the goal is to use less of the earth, then we might end up with less GDP. And I'll come back to that point in a little bit. So Canada's specific view of that you can see the top line, the lighter line, is the extraction of materials in Canada, and the darker reddish brown line is the consumption of materials in Canada. And so the relationship, the one-to-one relationship holds in Canada over the last 25 years. And I want to point out a couple of things. So the degrowth literature has mostly been based in Europe, European scholars, European activists. And so there's some aspects of here in North America that have of how degrowth might come about, or what's important in degrowth, that I think are important questions for us as North American degrowth scholars and activists to be thinking of. And the first is relevant to Canada in that European economies tend to consume more than they extract. Extraction happens elsewhere, and through unequal exchange, net resources flow into wealthy countries in Europe to be consumed there. Whereas in enormous and resource-rich countries like Canada, extraction is higher than consumption. The other thing is the question of settler colonialism. And so in North American countries, degrowth is different because it also coincides with the fact that the land that the resources that we're using comes from has been taken from indigenous people over the last 5 centuries. Whereas in Europe, colonialism is something that's happened elsewhere to extract materials to bring to Europe, and continues, according to some, through this unequal exchange, the unequal flow of resources, the net inflow of resources toward Europe. But these things are under theorized in the degrowth literature. And I know Kelly Gingrich, one of the folks who organized this seminar and is part of a group of student researchers who've started to study this question, and I'm part of a group called Degrow US, has started to think about, okay, how is degrowth different in a society that's a settler colonial society with questions of land back and indigenous sovereignty. But I think these things are really under sort of the frontier for me for research and degrowth in this part of the world. Okay, I'll move forward. These lines are a little bit abstract. What does it mean, like, more concretely? So in 2019, Canada's economy consumed 56 tons of materials per person during that year, and that produced $56,000 worth of economic value. And so the way the economy works is that $56,000 is also the average income of Canadians. And so the median income of Canadians, the 50th percentile, was actually $38,000 per person, because incomes are so unequal, and the super high income people, their incomes skew that average upward. But and they also consume more of the materials, as Peter talked about. So that means 153 kilograms of materials are taken from the earth each day to feed, clothe, house, and entertain the average Canadian. And a lot of those are like oil and gas that are burned to extract materials and process and transport materials that are going to be exported. But even if you take that out, it's still about 90 kilograms of materials are taken out of the ground and off the landscape in terms of trees and crops for Canadians every day. That's more than my body weight every day. And most of that's super invisible consequences of our consumption in our lives. And it's way more than humans need to live. And so, whereas the folks who originally started critiquing growth 50 years ago in the 70s, talking about limits to growth, were worried about resources running out. Now we're at a point where the problem is that the resources didn't run out. They didn't foresee that tar sands extraction and fracking were going to make it so the oil didn't run out. They didn't foresee that, like, increases in efficiency, rather than helping us conserve resources, we're just going to allow us to continue to grow. And now the problem is the economy's tailpipe and not its fuel tank, so to speak. The problem is damage, not scarcity. And so it's the consequences of taking all those materials from the earth that are causing the biggest environmental problems, which are climate change and the extinction of species, which is also called biodiversity loss. We're literally killing the living planet in order to serve economic growth. But I want to be clear that turning that around and going in the opposite direction isn't just saying, oh, we need to shrink the economy because that'll make life better. We know that when we shrink the economy as it is, that's a recession, and that causes suffering. The poor suffer first and most. Folks lose their jobs who need their jobs to live, and all that. what degrowth is arguing is kind of the opposite. It's that improving social and environmental conditions may well necessitate or even generate a reduction in production and consumption. Like, if everyone were guaranteed shelter without having to pay rent to landlords or a mortgage to the bank, people would probably choose to work less and might get by purchasing fewer things with the extra time off. And so, like, that improvement in social conditions would bring about a reduction in the overall scale of the economy. Another thing is, we can think about a climate saving moratorium on fossil fuels would probably constrain the aggregate output of the economy in the short run. If we were to say, hey, no more new fossil fuel extraction, then GDP would go down. So what we need is an economy that can meet people's needs regardless of what happens with GDP. And that's what degrowth is about. It's about reorganizing the economy of rich societies to allow people to meet their basic needs regardless of what happens with GDP. And so that movement brings together like resistance and alternatives, institutional politics, the policy stuff, and the extra institutional politics of direct action and mass protest. And I guess I'll end by saying that this sort of degrowth transition is going to involve expropriating private riches and constructing public wealth. Consume less and share more. I'm really excited about what kind of questions and comments will come from the audience. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks so much, Sam. Also an excellent presentation, and I think provide, complementary visions around both the technical aspects of what degrowth means and the challenges in moving towards it. So thank you. There are a lot of questions, and I really appreciate this voting procedure because it helps to determine which ones to ask. So what I might do is start by asking 3 questions. I'll read out 3 of the questions, and perhaps you can respond to them because there are relationships. There's some similarities between them. So here's one from Vlad Bunia. So given the tremendous urgency for systems change, what is the right balance between 1, top-down policies, and 2, bottom-up grassroots organizing and individual lifestyle changes? Then here, another one from Lisa Di Giulio. In a moment in which different actors, even in academia, are scared to talk about degrowth, how do you get people involved in imagining post-growth futures? And how do you communicate it effectively, especially in connection with Peter's point that degrowth is not the end point? And then finally, for this round of questions, one from Eduardo Urias. 800 million people don't have access to energy. 730 million are undernourished. How does one reestablish balance while also providing at least the most basic material comfort to those who are now excluded? So those are the 3 questions. One about top-down policies versus grassroots initiatives, another about the fear of discussing degrowth. How does one then make it kind of mainstream the idea? And the third one around the issue of degrowth in the context of inequality, which I think was somewhat addressed in Sam's talk, but obviously warrants, that question came in during Peter's talk, but obviously can be further discussed. So who would like to start? Peter, would you like to start?
Sure.
Thanks.
Excellent questions. Not sure about the answers, but we'll try our best. But I think both Vlad, who asked the first question, is aware, I think, that we need both kinds of approaches. There are some things which is very difficult to obtain just through grassroots action. Unless that action, of course, is directed towards the government to bring in policies that would make sense. And I would take, I don't want to just make this the whole thing about climate change, but that's an example where we have to work with, I believe, a national limit on emissions, and then from there, work out how to best allocate those emissions as they shrink to the different sources. You can't just do that from a grassroots thing built upwards. The interesting thing about grassroots action is it can also, though, energize people. It can lead them to take part in community activities, to build community, to make changes that only they can make, and improve their quality of life as they do it, which is a sort of a nicer outlook than having government impose limits on us that we will have to be obliged to follow. But I think clearly we need a combination. It's going to depend upon which dimension of degrowth you're focusing on as to the best way to go. The question about getting people involved in post-growth futures, there are again many answers to that. As I mentioned in my comments, what I find useful for this is simulation modeling, to show as an economist, using actually fairly standard economic tools, but using them to answer different questions, to show that there are very significant alternative futures from which we can choose. And I've given the same kind of presentation, though usually with more time allowed, to community groups, to municipalities, church groups, people like that. And they're just so relieved to see that there's a wide range of potential choices. Now, that's not enough, because people have to really believe they have the capacity to make the choice. And that takes you back to the question of grassroots action, political action, and so on. I don't know, but that's just what I do. Everybody has to go to their own strengths and work out how they can contribute to the change. I can only give you the example of what I've done. Mainstreaming it is tough because the mainstream doesn't like this worldview. They don't like this analysis. They don't like these proposed solutions. And I don't have a simple answer to that, except to keep talking about it, keep pushing it, keep making it more public. And I think we're seeing in Europe how effective that has been. It's a long way to go yet. As for the enormous number of people who are deprived, I take the view that the more the rich countries pursue economic growth, as normally defined, as Sam explained, the harder it gets to address those problems, particularly in the global south. And that by pursuing degrowth strategies in the north, we will actually take some of the pressure off the biosphere and make it easier to meet those requirements. It's not a simple balance. We do this, they do that. But I think degrowth gives more room to breathe in the general sense for poorer people to make some progress themselves.
Yeah,
thanks so much, Peter. Sam.
Yeah, on that last question, the only thing I would add is that the actual physical resources that it would take to bring 800 million people from undernourishment to food security, and another 800 million people, probably many of the same people, from not having access to energy to having access to energy. Those resources, the amount of resource use, and there's analyses on this published in the top scientific journals, is small potatoes compared to what could be reduced just by, just by material consumption in countries like Canada being what it was in the 90s. No one said in the 1990s there wasn't enough to go around, but the size of the Canadian economy was about half as big as it is today, So it was never a question about there's not enough. It's been unequal distribution from the beginning. Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to what Peter said. On the bottom up, top down question, we really need both, and the bottom up's really important because it gives politicians cover for making small changes. If people are asking for big changes, small changes happen at the level of policy. So we need to be out in the streets demanding that, writing our elected officials, getting the question of growth. In the US, we have Bernie Sanders, who's like really on the left compared to all American politicians on so many issues, but won't question growth. And so we need to break that taboo. Someone needs to. And things like direct action against, the expansion of the fossil fuel economy, new pipelines and stuff like that. That's blocking the physical manifestations of growth. But without policy, it's every no is temporary. It can always be reversed, and we get a yes on that pipeline later. So I think we need both.
Thanks so much, Sam and Peter. So I'll add a few more questions. I'm going to insert one of mine at the end here. So there a couple of these are related to one another. So I won't read them in order because there's two that I see as closely connected. So there's one from Sua Kim that asks, how does degrowth relate to migration, especially considering that degrowth focuses on localization, but there are and will be climate migrants? And then the two that I see is quite closely connected. One is from Ethan Shi. Currently, there is a big push by governments and industries to mine critical minerals such as lithium to fuel the energy transition. How do we rapidly electrify and decarbonize without over-extracting natural resources? And it's sort of complemented by one from Martin Sears, where he asks if it's possible to simultaneously pursue degrowth while also engaging in large-scale transition activities, which imply considerable investment in new capacity and technologies. And then the question that I sort of want to insert here, which maybe goes against the mainstreaming question, but is about whether or not degrowth is anti-capitalist. A question I've been wanting to ask Peter for many years, and I've sometimes in courses that I teach in political ecology, we've said, would Peter say that it's anti-capitalist, so or non-capitalist to have a no-growth model? So those will be them for now, and then there's a couple more we'll try to add in after this round.
Let Sam go first this time.
Sure.
Yeah, on migration. So I live in Vermont, and it's a good example of the interaction between degrowth and migration, because Vermont, according to all the climate models, is one of the least negatively affected. Still going to be terrible here. The climate changes to come that are already happening. We had terrible flooding this year, but least affected compared to everywhere else in the U.S. Places as the climate's breaking down. So degrowth is, the important thing to remember is that degrowth is like a macroeconomic thing, and it's not degrowing all sectors, it's not degrowing all places, it's using less materials and energy overall. And so a place like Vermont is going to have a lot more people living in it, and we just have to plan for that. And Vermont's not going to build border walls and raise its own military, God forbid, to defend it against migrants. There's just going to be a lot more people here, and so we need to build housing. Other places that are less habitable are going to depopulate. There's also the flow of people toward where the resources are. People in the global south migrate north because there's jobs and money and all the resources that were extracted from the south and sent to the north. And so hopefully that won't be the case. Hopefully degrowth is about global justice, and people might migrate for environmental reasons or whatever other reasons, but not because their home's unlivable, for economic reasons because of extraction, and other places are more livable because that's where the resources are piling up. But while conditions are as they are, people migrating to wealthier places is like a really, really effective way to reduce global inequality. So other questions about technologies. Martin's question, great question. You know more about it than I do. Transitioning a smaller energy system to run on low carbon sources is much easier than transitioning a large and growing one. That's the way I like to think about it. And about the question regarding capitalism, is I think degrowth has to be anti-capitalist, because growth is sort of an outcome of capital accumulation. I don't think degrowth is entirely incompatible with the existence of profit-making business and privately owned capital. I think we should have a lot less privately owned capital and profit-making business in the world, because organizing our ecological economy in pursuit of profit isn't working, clearly. That said, I don't think everybody who's interested in business needs to feel threatened by degrowth. I think that, like, capital C capital should feel threatened by degrowth.
Thanks. Thank you, Sam. Peter.
Okay, the first question is a very important one that was asked, and it's the question about degrowth and migration. Just so people know, one of the criticisms that's quite often made of the degrowth literature, particularly by people who come out of the steady state place, is that the main proponents of degrowth and theorists don't pay attention enough to population. And there is a view that the planet can support, I don't know, how can I put this? I think the danger is, as everybody probably appreciates, population is such a sensitive issue. It leads you to population control, which can be contentious, to limiting migration, which can be contentious, to only allowing immigrants to your country, to a rich country, because they're going to help economic growth, and penalizing the very people who are going to suffer, and so on. So I'm very glad the question's been asked. The only answer I would give is we need to know more about what drives migration. And on that basis, I would say the following: the worse the conditions in the country of origin are and become because of the direction we're going in now, the more likely you're going to get migration. And so degrowth, particularly in the global north, by taking pressure off the biosphere, I think can be said to reduce the pressures for migration. So it's actually a good thing from that point of view. Secondly, if it's true that degrowth in a physical sense also entails a lower GDP than you would otherwise have, lower incomes than you otherwise would have, that may reduce the incentive for people from poorer countries to come to richer countries, because they won't perceive such a large income gain. So these are all rolled into this question that you've asked that needs a much better answer than I've just given, but those are elements, I think, of an answer. As for the critical resources, well, this is where Sam and I think say the same thing. A degrowing economy in general requires fewer resources than a growing economy, especially one which isn't paying attention to resource limits. However, getting to Martin's insight that yes, but if we also are involved in an energy transition where we will have to increase the materials that go into wind farms and solar arrays, for example, how can you reconcile this? Again, it comes back to what Sam said. If we've got to make an energy transition anyway to deal with climate change, it's going to be easier to do that if we are clearly focused on reducing our material requirements than if we are focused on expanding GDP and then extracting whatever resources are required to do that. So I want to add a new word. I think it's a new application of a word that's come to mind during this discussion. It's not just degrowth we need to dethrone GDP. It's the pursuit of GDP which drives so many public policies, and not just in the economic area, that is causing us such a headache and not making people better off, particularly in the rich countries. And finally, the question that Anna wants to ask, I'm so sorry, Anna, we've run out of time now. No, I won't say that. I got to give you a little bit of an answer and then a bigger answer. The little answer is that one of the, again, virtues of simulating an economy that's degrowing is you can see what happens to the profit rate. If the profit rate went to zero, then clearly capitalism could not survive. And when I first used my model to address that question, the model wasn't built to address it, but turned out it was capable of, what did I find? The rate of profit doesn't go to zero, it declines, and capitalists will resist that. And they'll resist it with all the powers to them. But it's not because in that dimension alone, degrowth is fundamentally contradictory to capitalism. The problem is it's not in the interests of capitalists, then it will be opposed like so many other good ideas. But that's important to realize, and that is why my view on this question from a strategic point of view is that I think if you take capitalism as your primary target, which people have been doing for well over a century now, and really not succeeding, then I think too little and too late won't be effective. I come at the other way around. The sorts of limits on material use that I think are necessary because of the really increasingly obvious hazards increasing use is bringing, that will begin to cramp, well, already does cramp the style of capitalism. And that's why we see companies like Exxon, if there is another one like Exxon, probably not, but Exxon, deliberately keeping secret what it knew about the climate effects of greenhouse gases. This has now been exposed. This is what we're really dealing with. So the more we because they see the link between emissions reduction and their profits, the more that's made transparent, and the more we push for the emission reduction, because the case for that is getting stronger every day, the more that will change the nature of capitalism. And it may well be, and I expect it will be, that there'll come a time in the future, 50, 100 years perhaps from now, when whether or not capitalism was deliberately overthrown, people will look back and say, you know what? When they were talking about capitalism in 2023, I should say, it's a very different system now. And it's evolved, it's changed. That's not going to happen without crisis, without conflict, but it won't be the result of in my view, a deliberate attempt to overthrow the system.
Okay, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. So I'm going to try to put two questions together for this final wrap up. So one of them, I'm going to ask two questions that bring some different questions together. So one comes from Omar Tayeb that is related to others that came up, which is around the relationship between degrowth and the land back movement. And Omar refers specifically to the US, but one could talk about this anywhere in the world. And I know that as Kelly has pointed out, the next session in the series will be addressing this head on, but of course it'd be very interesting to hear your reflections on this as experts in the field. And the other is sort of a combination of a question from Robert Ferry and Enrico Melgar, which is around the relationship between not provoking sort of a reactionary backlash, so creating policies that won't lead to a reaction that will prevent this, and also understanding these dynamics within geopolitical tensions, for instance, between the US and China, where not only military buildup, but I would also note the comment that's made by many, for instance, Latin American structural economists, that China is actually far ahead of the US in so-called green energy versus the US, reinvention in the last decade and a half as a fossil fuel superpower. And those dynamics also influence these debates. So there's this one question around the land back and the other question around how to prevent a reactionary backlash in the context of geopolitical tensions over this transition. And with that, after those responses, I think we'll have to close the session. So thanks everyone for fantastic questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them.
I'm going to pass on the first question because I'm not really familiar with the land back movement, but I'm hoping Sam is. So I'll only address the second question. I don't think there's a way of not provoking a reactionary backlash. The question then is really how best to anticipate that and how to respond to it, not to think that we can make the kind of changes that degrowth calls for, and everybody's going to say, oh yes, never thought of that, let's get on with it. It's just unfortunately not as simple as that. But I do believe that it's possible to convince some people who might take that reactionary view that we can have degrowth and increase well-being of people and planet. One of the interesting things that have been coming out in research in the last number of years is that the kind of activities out of which people get the most enjoyment are often activities that require the least resources. So just simply being with friends, having a good time in a safe place doesn't require a lot of resources. Getting on a jet and flying to the other side of the world to visit some site, that requires a lot of resources. We may very well have to do less of the latter, but if that also allows us to do more of the former, we can all be better off as a result of that. So that literature is very well worth looking into for degrowth proponents. As for I can't think of a discussion I've been in for the last 20 years where China hasn't been mentioned. The Chinese will decide what China does. We can take different views on how well they are doing. You mentioned Latin America. China is now playing a very significant role in Latin America. And one of what I've learned from that is that one of the differences between Chinese involvement and US involvement is that the Chinese don't try to tell countries how they should govern themselves, and don't take action to change the way countries they are governing themselves because they don't like the look of it. And that is one of the reasons why Chinese involvement, and to some extent the same with the Russian involvement there, is really being welcomed by many Latin American countries. So there's something to be learned from that. There's no one way to govern a degrowth society. There's no one way to govern the transition to a degrowth society. We need to be open to all varieties, and I think recognize national and local sovereignty, and let people have the kind of lives they want to live, and not feel pressured by the West and the global North to live differently. And with that, I'll pass it over to Sam.
Thanks. So I guess I'll focus on the land back question. It's what I was getting to in my 10-minute talk, and saying that's the question. So the land back movement is about indigenous people in North America getting access to and control over their ancestral lands and the resources from those lands. And I think we don't know yet, but there's a potential alliance between degrowing the settler economy and land back for Native peoples. It seems obvious, and I think the conversations need to start, and I think they need to center indigenous voices, who may or may not be interested in degrowth, or it may sound like one more thing, to some indigenous environmental justice activists, even it may sound like one more imposition from the colonizer, and so like those conversations need to be like approached from a pretty humble position, in my opinion. As for the geopolitical questions, that for me, that's the other like big open question, is like degrowth puts countries at a geopolitical disadvantage, because like having a big economy makes you more potentially powerful in terms of violence. So degrowthers tend to be for peace, I guess.
Yes, thank you for that. As our colleague Ellie Perkins, who I think is here, pointed out not long ago, the military is one of the major producers of carbon emissions globally, right? So that is a very important point to
Anna,
close on.
Anna, before you close it, could I just take the liberty of letting people know about my latest book? Because it was, they can see that, I don't know.
It's Escape from Overshoot, Economics for a Planet in Peril. Yes, right. Thank you, Peter. Congratulations on that.
Lots of pictures. It's an easy read.
Wonderful. Well, we'll encourage everyone to go out and purchase the book. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but what a fantastic first panel in this series. Thank you so much, Lena. And I'll maybe hand it over to Lena to close then.
Yeah, just very briefly to thank again everyone who joined us, and invite you to check out the following sessions and join us again to continue having these conversations. And yeah, thank you to our speakers and to Anna for moderating so wonderfully. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.